Mated to the Alphas, a shapeshifter romance audiobook. Prepare yourself for a whirlwind of love, fierce intimacy, and heart-wrenching tragedy, in a story woven with twists, secrets, and bitter betrayals. The moonlight fell in silver threads across the forest, casting a strange, quiet beauty on everything it touched. My breath was shallow as I crept forward, every step silent, deliberate. I'd spent too many nights haunted by the face of Lucian, Alpha of the Moonveil Pack, to let my guard slip now. He was close enough that I could see his silhouette reflected in the water as he drank, unaware of the hunter in the shadows. I swallowed, steadying my heartbeat. Tonight would be the end of it. Slowly I raised my crossbow, my fingers steady as I aimed it right at him. Just one shot, and this nightmare would be over. But before I could release my breath, he moved, faster than my eyes could follow. In a blink, he was there, his hand gripping my arm in an iron hold, his face mere inches from mine. The crossbow clattered to the ground, useless.
Thought you could sneak up on me?
His voice was low, each word a quiet threat. I tried to wrench my arm free, but his grip was unbreakable. "Let go of me!" I spat, but the fear that quivered in my voice betrayed me. Lucian's eyes, a piercing, chilling blue, glinted with something between amusement and fury. Ignoring my protests, he lifted me as if I weighed nothing, throwing me over his shoulder. My fists pounded against his back, my kicks aimed at anything they could reach, but he didn't even flinch. The forest blurred around me as he carried me deeper into the trees, his pace steady, unstoppable. I could feel his muscles tense beneath me, each step echoing the hopelessness of my struggle. Soon, we reached his den, a stone and wood structure hidden among the trees, shadowed and cold. Lucian pushed open a heavy door, and I felt the chill of stone against my skin as he tossed me into a cell. The door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the dark. I pressed my back to the wall, breathing hard, my body still trembling. Lucian's face that close, those deep blue eyes, his sheer power, it all felt overwhelming. I had come to hunt him, but now I was his prisoner. My family had been hunting werewolves for generations, and here I was, trapped by one. My chest tightened with fear, every ounce of courage slipping away in the dark silence of the cell. Then suddenly, the cell door creaked open. I looked up, and my breath caught. Lucian stepped inside, no longer in his wolf form but human, and he was deadly gorgeous. His deep blue eyes seemed to pierce through me, and his bristly dark eyebrows added a fierceness to his gaze that was both magnetic and terrifying. He had a square jaw, his lips a rich red, full and inviting. I shuddered at the thought, pushing it away. He was tall, easily 6.5 feet, towering over me. His muscular frame filled the room, and his steps were slow, steady, deliberate. I backed away instinctively until my back pressed against the cold wall. He followed, not stopping, not speaking, his eyes fixed on me with a mix of curiosity and something darker. His presence was so intense it was almost suffocating. As he closed the space between us, I could feel my heart race, each beat a frantic pulse that I was sure he could hear. My breath was coming faster. As he stood so close, I could feel his warmth against my skin. I was gasping, my hands clenched at my sides, trying to stay calm, but failing miserably. He tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to understand every thought in my mind. He lifted his hand and gently brushed his thumb over my lips, his touch sending a strange thrill through me. His eyes dropped to my neck, and before I could react, he leaned in, his face grazing the curve of my shoulder as he breathed me in.
"You smell iron and rust,"
he murmured, his voice a dark whisper, right by my ear. His breath sent a shiver down my spine, leaving me feeling like prey, helpless, trapped. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every word, every thought seemed to have vanished under the weight of his presence. my body trapped between his and the wall, and I felt completely at his mercy, and Lucian, with a smirk tugging at his lips, seemed to know it.
Next time,
He whispered, his voice laced with a cold promise.
don't miss.
Then, just as suddenly as he had closed in, he pulled back, leaving me against the wall, still trembling, every nerve in my body alight with fear and confusion. The door closed behind him, and I sank to the floor, struggling to steady my breath. And as the moonlight filtered through the small window above, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever make it out of this den alive. I pulled my knees to my chest, the chill from the stone biting through my clothes, but my thoughts were crowded with memories. My bloodline, the Ashford family. We had one job, to keep humanity safe from the likes of Lucian and his kind. For generations, the Ashfords hunted down werewolves, protecting the balance between their world and ours. It was my duty, my legacy, and there was no way I was going to break that chain now, no matter what Lucian or his pack threw at me. I was pulled out of my thoughts by the sound of footsteps. They were light, almost hesitant, coming closer until they stopped right outside my cell. I looked up to find a woman standing there, maybe a few years older than me. Her clothes simple but neat. She looked like a maid, holding a plate of food. She avoided my gaze, slipping the plate through a small opening and keeping her head low.
Lucian says you should eat,
She said softly, barely looking in my direction. Anger flared up inside me, and I shoved the plate back across the floor with the tip of my boot, the metal clattering against the stone. Tell him I'd rather starve. I'll die of hunger before I touch anything that comes from his territory. The woman clenched her fists, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She looked at me then, her eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't quite read. Frustration, maybe, or pity. She huffed.
Fine then. Don't eat. But remember, you won't get another offer.
And with that she left, her footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving me alone with that untouched plate of food staring back at me. The night felt endless, stretching on in silence, broken only by the occasional creak or distant howl. I shifted on the floor, my stomach rumbling. But no matter how empty I felt, I wouldn't give in. Lucian could try all he wanted. I wasn't about to play by his rules. Morning crept in, a faint light seeping through that tiny window. I'd barely slept, my mind refusing to rest, but it didn't matter. I was ready, still determined, still strong, though my stomach had other ideas, growling angrily. Suddenly, voices broke the quiet, drifting down the corridor from somewhere near my cell. I tensed, listening closely. One voice was deep, smooth, Lucian's. I could pick it out anywhere now, having heard it close enough last night to recognize the slight, cold edge in his tone. But there was another voice, one I didn't know. It was softer, curious but firm, with a kind of intrigue that pricked my curiosity.
Have you brought the huntress?
The unfamiliar voice asked, curiosity lacing his words.
Yes,
Lucian replied with a hint of annoyance.
she's spirited, I'll give her that. Refused to eat a single bite last night, but let's see how long her pride holds up.
I clenched my fists, jaw tightening as I listened. So they thought they could just wait me out, like I was some stubborn child? They were underestimating me. The other man chuckled softly.
I'd like to see this famous Ashford spirit up close.
There was a pause, then Lucian replied,
Yes, she's in the cell. Go ahead, if you're that curious.
My heart pounded in my chest as I heard footsteps approaching, boots echoing on the stone floor. They were slow and deliberate, each step coming closer, filling the silence with a suspense that hung in the air. I stayed still, pulling my shoulders back and lifting my chin, ready to face whoever this man was. The heavy footsteps stopped right outside the cell. I looked up, and there he was, this stranger with an air of calm confidence. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes that were simple but fitted him well. His eyes were a quiet kind of intense dark brown, curious. He had this steady way about him, like he'd seen too much to be rattled by anything anymore.
So, how's the famous Ashford huntress holding up?
He asked, sliding his hands into his pockets. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge of curiosity, like he was genuinely interested, which surprised me. Wolves didn't care about the feelings of their prisoners. At least, that's what I'd been raised to believe. I narrowed my eyes. "I'm fine," I replied coldly, folding my arms. My words came out sharper than I intended, but I was exhausted, hungry, and honestly just sick of feeling helpless. He only gave a little nod, almost as if he expected my reaction.
I'm Noah, by the way, Alpha of the Eclipse Pack, and a friend of Lucian's.
"Lucky me," I replied, voice dripping with sarcasm. And here I was, hoping for a rescue.
Rescue?
He chuckled, and for some reason it didn't sound cruel.
Not quite. But I'm not here to make things worse, either.
He then pulled a small paper packet from his coat pocket and carefully slipped it through the bars, glancing at me with a subtle signal to keep it quiet. I looked down at the packet, some kind of dried fruit. Simple, but in that moment it looked like a feast. I hesitated, studying his face, but he just shrugged.
Eat it or don't. Your choice.
He said with a faint smile. It was hard not to trust that face, with his brown hair falling messily over his forehead and that calm, even gaze. But I'd learned a long time ago that trust was dangerous, especially with wolves. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "You're not like him, are you? You don't want this war." Noah sighed, dropping down to sit cross-legged on the floor across from my cell.
No, I don't.
His tone soft but firm.
But it's not that simple, Ruby. Lucian's pack, our pack, has been hunted, terrorized for generations. By your kind.
He looked up, and his gaze was suddenly fierce, though still sad somehow.
Can you blame him for his rage?
I frowned, the words sticking in my throat. "But he's a killer," I muttered, feeling a sudden chill at the memory of Lucian's fierce eyes, the strength in his grip. Noah tilted his head, his eyes never leaving mine.
And so are you.
He replied softly, like he was reminding me of a truth I'd been trying to forget.
But I can see the conflict in your eyes, Ruby. You don't truly believe in the monsters your family painted us to be.
I opened my mouth to argue, but his words had hit something deep inside me, somewhere I didn't want to go. For so long I'd been raised on the stories of bloodthirsty wolves, of beasts with no mercy. But sitting here, looking at Noah, I felt those beliefs beginning to crumble, piece by piece. Noah's gaze softened, almost as if he understood the struggle going on inside me.
I believe in coexistence, in peace between wolves and humans. But that doesn't mean I won't defend my family if I have to.
His eyes held a sadness I hadn't expected, a weight that I hadn't seen in the others.
Survival sometimes makes enemies out of people who might have been friends in another life.
I looked away, feeling my heart tighten. It was the first time I'd thought about wolves as anything more than a threat. They had families, lives they fought to protect, just like we did. And Noah's calm, his gentleness, it didn't fit into the stories I'd been told. It didn't match the cold hatred I was supposed to feel.
Ruby,
He murmured, drawing my attention back.
you're not like the others either. You're stubborn, sure, but there's something else. I can tell you're thinking, questioning, maybe even doubting what you were taught.
I clenched my jaw, not wanting to admit he was right, not wanting to admit that he had somehow seen through me so easily. "I don't know what you're talking about," I mumbled, though even I didn't believe myself. Noah just smiled, that gentle, knowing smile.
You'll figure it out.
He said simply. Then, without another word, he stood, brushing the dust off his pants.
I'll be back later.
He added before turning and disappearing down the dimly lit corridor, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. With a sigh, I opened the packet, finding some dried fruits and a few pieces of bread inside. It wasn't much, But after a day of refusing Lucian's food, it felt like a small lifeline. And for the first time since I'd been thrown in here, I allowed myself to take a bite, savoring the quiet defiance of doing it on my terms. As I chewed, I couldn't shake the memory of Noah's look, the way he'd slipped me the food without saying a word, without making a big deal out of it. It was confusing. Why would Lucian's friend go out of his way to help me, even a little? Later that afternoon, I found myself alone in the cell. I was sitting by the tiny window, looking out at the woods. Just as my thoughts were drifting, my eyes caught sight of something moving in the clearing near the big oak tree. I squinted to get a better look. I realized it was Lucian, his tall, rugged form moving with that mix of ease and quiet strength he always had. He seemed distracted, looking around before taking off his shirt. My breath caught in my throat, but I told myself to look away, to give him privacy. Instead, my eyes stayed glued to him. Lucian started unbuttoning his shirt, each motion slow and deliberate, revealing the strong lines of his back. My gaze trailed down, catching every curve and scar, wondering at the story behind each one. I caught myself biting my lip, lost in the memory of his touch, the way his thumb had gently traced over my lips, leaving a lingering warmth that hadn't quite faded. His hands moved to his waistband, and I could feel my cheeks growing warm, my pulse picking up, as he undid his belt and slid his pants down his hips, leaving himself completely bare. A warmth crept up my neck. My hand moved to my chest, absent-mindedly, pressing lightly as I watched him like this. I wasn't even sure why I was reacting this way, but there was something so intense about it, about him, that I couldn't turn away. I'd always been terrified when he was near, his presence wrapped in rage and anger. But today there was a quiet vulnerability in the way he stood. Slowly, his body began to shift, limbs changing shape, skin turning to fur, and within moments, he had transformed completely, standing on 4 paws where a moment ago a man had stood. Lucian, now in his wolf form, gave a gentle shake, his fur catching the light. He looked around once, a quiet, cautious scan of his surroundings, then disappeared into the thick of the forest. I released a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my hand still resting over my chest. 3 days had passed, and I felt every minute of it. The hunger gnawed at me, my stomach twisting in protest. But I was determined, just as stubborn as the Ashford blood running through me. Each morning that woman brought food, silently setting it just within my reach, and each time I left it untouched. The smell tempted me, but I refused to give in. By now, the cold stone walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I could feel my strength fading. Even moving was exhausting. My clothes were dirty, my skin felt grimy, and I was pretty sure my hair was a tangled mess. But none of that mattered. This was my way of holding on to control, no matter how small. Then, on the 4th morning, something was different. I heard the familiar footsteps, and I knew it was the woman again. But this time, a heavier, slower set of steps followed hers. My heart pounded as I realized who it was. Lucian. When he stepped into my cell, his presence filled the space like a storm. His dark hair fell in tousled waves around his face, accentuating his sharp features. I fixed my gaze on the cold stone floor, unable to meet his intense eyes. My heart raced, pounding like a drum against my ribs. I could feel his eyes boring into me, and I wished I could disappear.
Eat,
He demanded, his voice low and commanding. I didn't respond, too terrified to speak. Instead, I trembled, feeling small and powerless beneath his scrutiny. My body was soaked in sweat and a mix of fear. I wished for the courage to stand up to him, but my throat felt tight, and all I could do was stare at the floor. Lucian's patience snapped. I heard the cell door creak as he opened it, and I felt a wave of dread. He stepped inside, and before I knew it, he was standing right in front of me. The heat of his frustration seemed to fill the small cell.
don't compel me to force you, Ruby.
he shouted. I stayed still.
Enough of this.
He muttered, his voice edged with anger. Without warning, he grabbed a handful of my tangled hair, forcing my head back so I had no choice but to look up at him. His face was close, too close. I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the cold intensity in his eyes. I felt his breath on my face, hot and intense as he held me in place, and with his other hand, he scooped a piece of food from the plate, bringing it to my mouth.
Eat.
He demanded, again his voice a dark whisper. Reluctantly, I opened my mouth, feeling a surge of helplessness as he fed me. His eyes locked into mine. The taste hit my tongue, and despite everything, my body welcomed the food. With each bite, he fed me, and as I surrendered to his rhythm, he gradually loosened his grip on my hair, the tension giving way to an intimate trust. By the time he finished, he released my hair, stepping back to create a space that felt both charged and tender. I gasped for air, trembling, the tension in my muscles releasing slightly, and I sank back, avoiding his gaze. Lucian watched me, his expression unreadable, and as he turned to leave, I felt a rush of defiance. I grabbed the water bottle from the tray. Without a second thought, I unscrewed the cap and tipped it over myself, letting the cool water spill over my head. As I splashed water over myself, my clothes dampened, clinging to my form. Lucian's gaze lingered for a moment, his eyes tracing over me with a quiet intensity before he finally spoke.
Why did you do that?
He asked, raising an eyebrow in surprise. Humans take baths daily, I replied, my voice shaky but firm. I needed to remind him of my humanity, even in this place that felt more like a prison. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing before he slowly clapped his hands 3 times. The sound echoed in the cell, sharp and commanding. Moments later, 2 women appeared at the door, looking between me and Lucian with wide eyes.
Take her to a cabin.
He ordered, his tone brooking no argument. As they approached, I whispered, "Why don't you just take my life?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, a desperate plea for understanding. Lucian paused, his back to me.
Werewolves don't do that.
He replied, his voice low but steady.
We are not cruel, like humans.
His words hung in the air, and I was left grappling with the weight of them. Did he truly believe that? Was I misinterpreting the nature of werewolves? This question echoed in my mind, lingering and unresolved. As the women led me away, I glanced back at him. He remained still, watching me go. As we reached the cabin, my breath caught in my throat. The cabin was luxurious, with a big fireplace crackling in the corner and plush sofas that looked inviting enough to sink into. There were dark wooden beams overhead and a thick, soft rug under my bare feet. It felt like a sanctuary, and yet I was still a captive here.
Make yourself at home,
One of the women said, a hint of mockery in her tone.
until your owner makes another choice.
I ignored her, my mind racing. What did Lucian want from me? Would he keep me here forever? I needed to think and plan. The bathroom caught my eye, a large tub filled with steaming water. My heart jumped at the thought of a hot bath. I needed it. The tub was ready. I sank into the warm water, letting it envelop me like a soft blanket. I closed my eyes, trying to forget where I was, even if just for a moment. The heat eased the tension in my muscles and calmed my racing heart. It was a luxury I hadn't expected to find here, and I savored it. I thought about everything that had happened. Eventually, I emerged from the tub, wrapping myself in a towel. As I stood before the mirror, combing my hair, I tried to gather my thoughts. I focused on the simple action, letting the rhythm of brushing my hair distract me from my worries. Just as I got lost in the task, I heard the door creak open. Lucian stepped inside. My stomach twisted, and I felt heat rush to my cheeks. His eyes roamed over me, taking in the sight of me in nothing but a towel. I couldn't move. I felt frozen, my heart thumping in my chest like a drum. He stepped closer, his gaze locked onto mine. The air thickened, heavy with tension. I could feel his breath against my neck, pressing his coarse fingers over my lips.
Now you can stay in this cabin,
He murmured, sending shivers down my spine.
but don't try to run away. I will find you.
I was terrified, my skin slick with sweat. I swallowed hard, forcing a nod in response. He leaned in closer, inhaling the scent lingering on the curve of my neck. Every instinct screamed at me to push him away, but fear rooted me in place, leaving me frozen.
Good,
He said, his voice low.
because I have ways of finding out.
With that, he turned and left, leaving me breathless and trembling. My mind raced with thoughts of escape. I had to get out of here. It was so late, and I'd been tucked under the covers, finally trying to drift off after the long, restless day. I was in nothing but an old tank top and shorts. Just as I was about to sink into sleep, a feeling crept over me. Something sharp, like the prickle of being watched. And before I even opened my eyes, I just knew. It was Lucian. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his dark eyes steady. I looked up at him, trying not to shiver under his stare, but I was failing miserably. He glanced at me, then back at the untouched food the maid had left earlier that evening. I knew what was bothering him. Without a single thought, I quickly picked up the plate, grabbing the fork as I scooped a small bite, holding it up like I was making some grand show of surrendering. He didn't say a word, and it felt like a challenge. He knew he didn't have to say anything. The look in his eyes said it all. He was amused, probably pleased to see me doing something he'd told me to do. I'd been holed up in this cabin for days now. Lucian would drop by now and then, checking if I was all right, though he'd left a few servants around to see to any needs I might have. But there was no mistaking it. I was trapped here with Lucian's watchful eyes always on me. I sat by the small, worn table, the wood rough under my hands. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in, and with each tick of the clock, my patience thinned. Today, though, Noah was here, and his visits had become my only real comfort. He'd bring food, share stories, even offer a smile that seemed to break through the dark around me. His warmth, his understanding, it was rare here. For a moment, I'd almost feel free. We sat across from each other, the silence comfortable but heavy. I felt a lump in my throat as I tried to hold myself together. But it was no use. My eyes filled with tears, and before I knew it, I was crying. "Noah," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "I can't keep doing this. I need to get out of here." He reached across the table, his hand finding mine. His touch was warm, grounding.
Ruby,
He said softly, his brown eyes deep with something that felt like regret.
it's not that easy. You know your family's history with Lucians. They've hunted him and our kind for generations.
I felt a chill at his words, and the silence settled again, thick with unspoken things. I looked away, but he didn't let go of my hand. Slowly, he leaned closer, brushing his thumb over my knuckles, his fingers tracing the lines of my hand like he was trying to memorize it. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the frustration, the loneliness, or just the way his touch sent a shiver through me. He leaned in, and before I knew it, our lips met. The kiss was intense, almost desperate. I felt his hands on me, his fingers tracing my shoulders, moving down my arms, exploring the curve of my waist. His touch was electric, grounding like he was trying to keep me anchored here with him. I kissed him back, my fingers winding into his hair as he pulled me closer. For a moment, I lost myself in the warmth, the closeness of it all, feeling the world blur around us. But then, a sound from the doorway pulled me back. I froze, breaking the kiss and looking up to see Lucian standing there, his eyes fixed on us. He didn't say a word, but his jaw was tight, his gaze sharp, intense. The air was charged with a tension that made my heart pound. Noah straightened, leaning back to give Lucian some space. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence with a calmness that surprised me.
Lucian, Have you told Ruby about your past?
Lucian's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze shifting from me to Noah, then back again. He let out a low breath, his voice rough.
No, not yet.
I felt my pulse quicken, caught between the two of them, feeling the weight of whatever unspoken history lay between us. I had to plan. The cabin was beautiful, but I couldn't let its allure fool me. I was still trapped, and I would find a way to break free. I had to come up with a plan. Even Noah couldn't get me out of here, so finally, I decided to take matters into my own hands. That night, when darkness wrapped around the cabin like a blanket, I made my move. My heart pounded as I slipped on a pair of old boots I found by the door. The wood floor creaked under my weight, but I couldn't afford to think about that. I needed to be quiet. The door to my room was ajar, the moonlight spilling in from the window. I stepped into the hallway, keeping my breath steady. Every sound felt magnified, echoing in the stillness. I glanced back toward my room, my heart heavy. I couldn't afford to hesitate. I had to keep moving. As I reached the front door, I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The thrill of freedom was tantalizing, but I knew that if I was caught, there would be consequences. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my goal. I had to get away from Lucian, to reclaim my life. With one last glance back, I turned the knob and stepped into the cool night air, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. The moment I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. My heart raced as I took off into the darkness, each footfall pounding against the earth like a drum. I ran, losing myself in the rhythm of my breath, the trees whizzing past me like shadows in the night. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to escape the chaos in my mind. But after a while, my legs burned, and my breath turned shallow. I stumbled, resting against a gnarled tree, its bark rough against my palm. I could feel the panic bubbling up inside me, a tightness in my chest that wouldn't let go. Suddenly, a rough hand gripped my arm from behind and I jolted, heart pounding in my throat. I turned to find Lucian, his fierce gaze blazing with barely contained rage. He didn't need to raise his voice. The tension in his controlled demeanor was enough. His jaw tightened, the sharp lines of his face etched with simmering fury as he surveyed anyone bold enough to cross him. His light blue eyes had turned steely, glinting with a predatory intensity that warned of the storm beneath his calm exterior. Fear shot through me. I was trembling, unable to form words, my mind racing through the countless thoughts of escape. Before I could react, he lifted me off the ground, slinging me over his shoulder like I weighed nothing. "Lucian, put me down!" I cried, squirming against him. But it was futile. His grip was ironclad. As he carried me back to the den, I could feel the heat radiating off him, a wild energy that both terrified and excited me as I hung there, helpless and at his mercy. When we reached the den, he threw open the door with a force that made it bang against the wall. It was a mix of fear and confusion. I didn't know what to expect from him anymore. He dropped me onto the bed, his movements sharp and animalistic. Lucian funneled his anger into a single, precise action, a powerful punch that shattered the nearest vase, shards scattering like a silent warning. His fury was both brutal and restrained, a force held tightly in check, reminding anyone nearby of the power he kept leashed. In his rage, he was a formidable presence, the kind of leader whose wrath commanded both fear and unwavering respect. And yet, I couldn't look away, captivated by the storm raging within him. Here was a man haunted by pain, scarred by years of loss, a story that drew me in, perhaps more deeply than I'd let myself believe. His fury sent my heart racing, but beneath that pulse of fear, a flicker of empathy softened the edges, stirring something achingly familiar within me. I watched Lucian from across the room, my heart heavy with an ache I hadn't felt before. The way he stared into the flames, shoulders hunched, gaze distant, made me realize he was anything but the fierce creature I'd first thought him to be. Beneath all that anger and strength, there was something broken, something scarred, a quiet tragedy hidden just beneath his tough exterior, and for some reason, knowing that felt like it hurt me as much as it must have hurt him. The silence between Lucian and me was thick as fog. Suddenly he turned towards me. His eyes were blazing as he stalked closer. Every step he took made the air in the room feel heavier. His broad shoulders, tense with restrained fury, looked like they could carry the weight of his entire pack. And yet here he was, breathing down on me, as if I were his biggest threat.
I told you I'd find you out.
He growled, his voice low, edged with a danger that sent a shiver up my spine. His hand wrapped around my arm, firm, too firm for me to handle. I closed my eyes, feeling hot tears spring to them. The anger radiating from him was almost too much, a wildfire too close to home. Then, as suddenly as he'd grabbed me, his grip softened. He must have noticed the tears streaking down my face. Without a word, he reached up, brushing his thumb against my cheek, wiping them away. That simple touch, a stark contrast to the fierceness I knew he carried, was enough to make me lose my grip on all the walls I'd built.
Ruby.
He murmured, and my name sounded like a promise, like a plea. I didn't know how to put it into words, so instead, I reached up, my fingers hesitating before I let them slide gently through his hair. It was soft, softer than I'd imagined, and I hoped my touch could soothe some of the storm inside him. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into my touch, a flicker of peace crossing his face. I remembered the first time I saw him fully transform. His body, as wild and primal as the beast inside him, shifting from man to wolf under the moon's light. The raw power, the undeniable grace, it was mesmerizing. Even now, the memory sent a jolt through me. His lips found my neck, pressing a kiss that sent shivers straight to my core.
You smell heavenly.
He murmured against my skin, his voice raw, almost reverent. Then his mouth was on mine, fierce, demanding, his tongue tracing slow, deliberate paths that left me breathless. I couldn't resist. I didn't want to. My hands found their way down his chest, feeling the strength beneath until I was on my knees, unbuttoning his pants. His sharp intake of breath spurred me on, and I traced his muscled lines, each kiss a silent promise. Lucian's hand tangled in my hair, his gaze searing as he looked down at me. His blue eyes darkened with something wild, something forbidden. He lifted me with ease, his arms around me, carrying me over to the small, worn bed. There was no hesitation as he undressed me, his hands exploring every curve, every inch of my skin, and I found myself responding to his touch with a fire I didn't know I had, matching his intensity with a fierce need of my own. When his body pressed against mine, I felt like I was drowning, consumed by the force of him, the weight of us. He was commanding, dominating in a way that left no doubt about who he was. Lucian, the wolf who'd been both my captor and, somehow, my salvation. Every touch, every kiss felt like a battle, a raw clash of wills that left me breathless. And when we reached that final moment, when every wall, every barrier fell away, he held me close, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. For that one brief moment, we weren't enemies or rivals. We were just two souls tangled in something far too deep and far too strong to fight. The warmth of his kiss lingered on my forehead long after he pulled away. I lay there, my heart racing, feeling the weight of something unspoken between us. Lucian got up, moving with purpose to a small chest tucked against the cabin wall. He pulled out a weathered document, its pages thick and edges frayed. The words across the front, written in bold, faded ink, caught my eye. Documented attacks by the Ashford family.
This has everything your family has done to my kind. It's what I wanted you to see.
The weight of his words settled heavy in my chest. The Ashford name was etched into this. My family, my heritage. and all I could think was that I'd never seen Lucian like this before. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I took the document from him. But the moment my hand lifted, his eyes dropped to my wrist. The crescent moon birthmark, something I'd had since as far back as I could remember, caught his gaze. He stilled, and in an instant, the softness I'd just seen was gone, replaced by something far darker, intense and sharp, and I could feel his anger radiating off him like heat.
What is this?
He demanded, his voice a low growl. What? I glanced at my wrist, confused. This mark? It's always been there.
You've been hiding it.
He accused, stepping back, his gaze burning into me.
I trusted you, Ruby. And you.
His jaw clenched and he looked away, his hands balling into fists.
You were never supposed to tell me.
Lucian, you're not making sense. I tried to keep my voice steady, but the hurt was starting to creep in. Why would I hide anything from you? And why are you talking to me like this? He turned his back on me, breathing hard, his shoulders tense. Every line of his body screamed anger, but there was something else there too, something like fear. It was as if that tiny crescent moon had shaken him to his core, and I had no idea why. Finally, he spun around, his eyes flashing.
You don't get it, do you?
He grabbed my wrist, holding it up.
This mark. It's not just some birthmark, Ruby. It's a sign. And you've known all along, haven't you? You were never supposed to trust me.
The accusation hurt more than I'd expected. Lucian, I don't know what you're talking about. I've had this mark since birth. It's just a part of me. He stared at me for a moment, a storm raging behind his blue eyes.
I can't believe you'd hide something like this.
He dropped my wrist, his face a mix of anger and something almost like betrayal, after everything we've been through. Lucian, I whispered, reaching out, but he stepped back, refusing to meet my gaze. The distance between us felt like a chasm, one I didn't know how to cross. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the cabin, clutching that worn document to my chest, my heart heavy and aching. The cabin was quiet now. My thoughts seemed to echo in the silence, and I couldn't shake the hollow ache in my chest where Lucian's words had landed. I had cried myself into exhaustion, staring at the empty space where he had stood, trying to piece together what I'd done wrong. He'd left me without a single answer, just that angry look, that hurt I could see even though he tried to hide it. I kept replaying it all over and over, but nothing made sense. I finally wiped my tears and took a deep breath. My hands shook as I opened the worn document he'd handed me, the one holding a history that was supposed to explain his hurt. There, on the first page, in faded ink, I read, Year 1829. There has been an agreement between the Ashford family and the Moonvale Pack. No more war. The Moonvale Pack will not attack any humans. Instead, we will feed on the remains of dead animals. We halted the war from our side, yet the Ashford family continued their attacks on us. I closed my eyes for a moment, the words sinking in like cold water. My family, the Ashfords, had promised peace, but broke that promise. Again and again. I read on, feeling each word scrape against something raw inside me. The next entry was dated just 1 year later. Year 1830. First attack after the agreement, documented by Cassian, son of Julian. The Ashford family attacked our pack without warning. Homes were destroyed. Wolves fled, trying to save their lives. In that attack, Julian, my father, and the Alpha of the Moonvale Pack was killed. I swallowed hard, my heart aching for the family I'd never known, for the betrayal I was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just history on a page. These were wounds that had scarred Lucian's family, the lives they had built, shattered by people with my blood. I kept reading, each new line bringing fresh waves of grief and guilt. It was like peeling back a layer of truth I'd never been prepared for, each word heavier than the last. Year 1990. Documented by Asher, a member of the Moonvale Pack. We were celebrating the birth of Lucian, our future Alpha. It was a night of joy and laughter. But the Ashford family attacked again. Half the pack was lost. Those who survived had to flee their territory. My stomach twisted as I imagined the chaos of that night. The Ashfords had turned their joy into a nightmare. And Lucian, he was just a baby. He'd grown up surrounded by loss, by pain my family had caused. How could I ever look him in the eyes again, knowing this? I flipped through to the last page, the most recent entry. It was dated 1998. Documented by Lucian.
It was the night of my uncle's wedding. We had gathered to celebrate family, to feel hope again, but the Ashford family came and once more we ran. My mother told me to run as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was in another territory. When I returned the next day, my family was gone. I was left with only a handful of pack members, all that remained of the Moonvale Pack.
My vision blurred as I read those words, the pain etched in every line. I could almost see Lucian as a young boy, frightened, running alone in the dark, losing everything he'd known. Tears filled my eyes, and this time, I didn't hold them back. I cried for Lucian, for his family, for the trust he'd placed in me that was now shattered. I cried for the past I never knew but was somehow part of, this dark legacy that clung to me like a curse. What was I supposed to say to him now? How could I ever make him believe that I hadn't known, that I'd never wanted this? I clutched the document to my chest, feeling the weight of all those years of betrayal. For the first time, I truly understood why Lucian had looked at me the way he did. As I sat there, my heart breaking for him, I knew I had to try. I couldn't undo the past, but I could try to make things right. Because this wasn't just his story. It was ours now, no matter how complicated or painful it had become. And if I was going to stand beside him, I'd have to face the past, no matter how dark it was. For the first time, I wasn't just an Ashford anymore. I was Ruby, and I wanted to be someone he could trust. I stood at the door of Lucian's room, my heart heavy with all I have read. I could hear him moving around inside, the quiet shuffle of his boots against the wooden floor, the sound of something, probably a glass, slamming down onto a table. My stomach twisted, but I gathered all courage I had. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. Silence. A long, empty silence. "Lucian," I called softly, resting my hand against the door. "Please, can we talk?" For a moment I thought I heard him walking closer, but he didn't open the door.
I don't think there's anything left to say.
He replied, his voice low and rough. There was a hardness in his voice. "But you don't understand," I said, feeling my words tumble over each other. "It's not that I didn't want you, Lucian. I really didn't know about the mark."
No, it was simple.
His voice cut through me like a blade.
You didn't trust me. That's all there is to it, Ruby. You didn't think that we both can stay together.
I swallowed, my mouth dry. "Lucian, it wasn't like that." He let out a bitter laugh.
Then why didn't you tell me about the mark?
He was so close to the door that I could hear his breathing, ragged, full of everything we hadn't spoken about.
Even when we shared those moments together. Because you didn't even trust me enough to share that with me.
I sank against the door, resting my forehead against the wood, aching to bridge the distance between us. No matter how hard I tried, Lucian wouldn't listen. He wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't even look at me. I was alone, wrapping myself in a woolly blanket and trying to process everything that had happened with Lucian, his words, his glances, the way his presence stayed with me long after he'd left. My feelings for him were complex, intense, yet here I was waiting for Noah, my oldest friend, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. When Noah finally walked in, I couldn't help but notice the tension in his jaw, like he'd been waiting for this moment as much as I had. He took one look at me and smiled, but his eyes held something sharper, a bit darker. Without saying anything, he walked over and sat down beside me, close enough that I could feel his warmth, and that old familiar ease settled between us. "Noah," I said, glancing down at the birthmark on my wrist that had been there as long as I could remember. "Do you know what this means?" I asked, half joking but feeling a strange pull to the mark I hadn't felt before. He studied my wrist when I showed him the birthmark, eyes widening with surprise.
Ruby, this mark, it's not just any birthmark. There's a prophecy about it. They say a woman with this mark is destined to choose the strongest mate, one who will become the most powerful alpha.
The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. I had known the mark was unique, but a prophecy? That felt bigger than anything I'd ever prepared for. Before I could even process it, he was closer, his hand reaching up to cradle my face. His lips found mine, fierce, insistent, like he was desperate to bridge a gap that had already opened between us. I pushed back, gasping for air. "Noah, no, I can't," I said, shaking my head. But he didn't stop. He pulled me again, kissing more fiercely, his lips brushing down to my neck, leaving trails of warmth and confusion in their wake. His arms tightening around me even harder, his hands moving on the edges of my curves. There was that familiar ache, a whisper of what had been between us. But my heart felt loyal to Lucian now, no matter how much Noah's touch affected me.
What's the problem, Ruby?
He asked, his voice strained, his gaze searching mine. I took a shaky breath. "We're just friends, Noah." A bitter laugh escaped him.
Friends? You call what we had just friendship? You forget the day we kissed? Was that just friendship to you?
I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. No, it wasn't. But things are different now, Noah. He clenched his jaw, the pain evident in his eyes.
So, you're with someone else? Already claimed?
"Yes, it's Lucian," I managed to say somehow. "Please stop, Noah, it's not right," I whispered.
I don't know how to stop.
Noah growled almost possessively. The fire in his eyes shifted, growing darker, rawer. His grip not ready to leave me. He leaned over me, his presence filling the space above me on the bed. His lips crashed against mine one last time, desperate, almost bruising, sliding my clothes off my shoulders. And before I knew, he tried pressing on me, as if he thought he could change everything with that single moment. I could feel the jealousy and hurt, and it tore at me. He was fierce, a storm unwilling to calm. "Enough, Noah. Stop," I demanded. He froze, as if he woke up from a dream he had been dreaming of, hands trembling against me, lingering on my waist as if holding on was all he knew how to do. But slowly, reluctantly, his hands slipped away from me. His gaze softened, the pain of letting me go flashing through his eyes, and for a moment, a flicker of hope lingered, hoping I'd change my mind.
Yeah, I get it. I have always loved you, Ruby. Just remember that.
He murmured, voice rough and painful. The weight of that goodbye settled heavily between us. Without thinking, I ran from the room half-dressed and breathless, my heart pounding harder with each step, and I barely noticed how disheveled I looked. Barely dressed, thoughts jumbled in my mind, swirling with Noah's desperation, his accusations, and the confusion I hadn't shaken off. But before I could make sense of any of it, I collided hard into something solid. I stumbled back, feeling the warmth of strong hands steadying me. "Lucian," I whispered, my voice barely holding. His face was shadowed in the dim light, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, looked down at me, flaring rage. The kind of anger that felt like it could cut the air between us. He took a slow step back, his gaze shifting down to my disheveled, half-dressed state. Shame flushed my face, and I tugged my clothes tighter around me. But his look, that mix of anger and pain, it sent my heart spiraling into panic. I opened my mouth, the words falling out almost in a rush. "It's not what you're thinking, Lucian." His hand came up to my cheek, lifting my face until I had no choice but to meet his eyes.
Yes, Ruby. It's not what I was thinking about you.
He said, voice low and cold.
It is worse because I never thought you'd betray me like this.
Lucian, please.
How could you be unfaithful with a man you slept beside just 2 days ago? And maybe I shouldn't be surprised, considering the bloodline you come from, the Ashford family. I forgot that. I am so sorry.
My blood ran cold, his words stinging like nothing else. I could feel myself trembling, every part of me wanting to explain, to tell him the truth, but I couldn't find the words, as if they'd scattered the moment I'd felt his anger. Out of nowhere, Noah's voice broke through, coming up from behind me.
Lucian, it's not her fault. I compelled her.
He said, stepping forward. Lucian's gaze snapped to him, his eyes narrowing dangerously. Before I knew it, he was gripping Noah by the collar, lifting him.
You compelled her? How dare you touch her, Noah? How dare you mess with her mind?
Lucian's voice was so low, so deadly. Their eyes locked in a furious battle, both of them brimming with rage. I could feel the tension pulsing, the anger ready to explode. I took a shaky breath, my heart racing as I tried to find my voice. "Lucian!" I called, my voice barely reaching him. He didn't look away from Noah, his hand tightening. I tried again, louder. "Lucian!" Nothing. It was only when I stepped forward, closing the gap, and gently held his face, my hand trembling as it touched his cheek, that he stilled. His eyes flicked to mine, the hardness softening just a little. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, something hesitant and raw, as if he didn't want to look away but feared what he'd see. He waited, his anger ebbing, just holding my gaze, and I knew he was giving me the chance to say something, anything. And in that moment, all I wanted was for him to hear my heart over every misunderstanding. I stood there looking up at Lucian, and for the first time in his gaze I saw commitment, how fiercely dedicated he was, not just to protect me, but to see me, to know me. "Lucian," I started, my voice a little shaky, but I pressed on. "I never told you, because I was scared. I didn't know how you'd react, what it would mean for us, but today, I'm not afraid. I need you to know the truth, and whatever you choose, I'll accept it." He loosened his grip on Noah's collar. He stepped back, and Noah straightened up, brushing off his shirt but keeping a respectful distance. I glanced over at Noah, and for a brief second, I caught the soft look in his eyes, a reminder of the quiet loyalty and tenderness he'd shown me all those months ago. "Noah," I said softly, a little smile pulling at my lips, "was the only person I had when you first brought me here, Lucian. I had no one, no family, no friends. I was just alone. He made me feel comfortable in a strange, dark world, and before I ever felt anything for you, I appreciated him for taking care of me, for doing the little things, like bringing me tea, making me laugh." Noah's face softened, that familiar smile warming his features. Lucian's expression didn't waver, but there was something more open about it now, a glint of understanding I hadn't expected. "I cared about him, Lucian. He made me feel safe." I could tell by the tightening of Lucian's jaw that these weren't easy words for him to hear, but I kept going. "Before I ever knew you, Noah was the one I leaned on, and there was this one day. We kissed. It was simple, and it was during that time I thought that maybe there could be something between us. I was lonely, and he was the one person who made me feel like I wasn't." Lucian's gaze flickered with something, hurt, jealousy, maybe both. but he didn't pull away. He just listened. It was Noah who told me about you, about your past, the things you've been through. I didn't know why, but it was then that I began to feel something different. Something deeper for you. I saw strength in you, a sense of loyalty and protectiveness I'd never felt from anyone else. And from that point on, my heart started leaning toward you. Lucian's grip on my shoulders tightened. His gaze softened towards Noah. I could tell he was fighting his own emotions, but instead of pushing me away or looking hurt, he pulled me closer, his arms wrapping around me with a kind of fierce protectiveness that took me by surprise.
Ruby,
He murmured, his voice rough with emotion.
I'm sorry. I can't imagine what it was like for you, feeling like you had no one, relying on Noah when I should have been there for you.
He paused, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the mix of regret and longing.
Maybe I should have understood sooner, and for that, I'm sorry.
Before I could even respond, he pulled me into a tighter embrace, his face pressing into my hair as he held me, his body warm and solid against mine. And in that moment, I could feel all the unspoken words, the things we hadn't said yet, filling the space between us. Just then, I looked up at Noah. He was smiling at me, and I smiled back. He looked between us, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. Lucian turned to him, his expression genuine, almost regretful.
Noah, I thank you, and I'm sorry.
Lucian drew him in, wrapping him in a firm, unspoken embrace. Seeing both Alphas embrace and rekindle their friendship filled me with happiness. Noah gave a small nod, and a quiet smile touched his lips. We'll need each other now more than ever, he said, clearing his throat as he adjusted his collar.
We'll need each other now more than ever. The Alphas are on their way. We both have to prepare our packs.
Lucian's jaw tightened, and I could feel the fierce warrior side coming back.
The mark on Ruby's wrist. We're the last ones to know its meaning, aren't we?
Noah nodded, his face growing grim.
They know what it means, and they will come to take Ruby.
Noah paused, glancing over at me with that easy smile he wore so well.
Ruby, I don't want to be the most powerful Alpha anymore. I don't need power.
He paused, swallowing hard.
All I need is you by my side, even if it's just as a friend.
I smiled at him, tears streaming down my cheeks. I couldn't say anything but nod. The night was thick under a silver moon. As Lucian, Noah, and I took our positions on the battlefield, the other packs had closed in, each leader fighting with every ounce of strength to lay claim to something greater than power. They were here for loyalty, for love, and for vengeance. Lucian stood to my right, a fierce determination in his eyes that softened only when they met mine. The way he held his sword, sharp and steady, I could feel the weight of every unspoken promise we had between us. Noah, on my left, his lips tight but his eyes steady, looked at me like I was the only thing that kept him standing. Both men were Alphas, leaders in every sense of the word, but their resolve tonight wasn't just about a title, it was about me.
Stay close, Ruby.
Lucian murmured, his voice steady but soft, like he was afraid to let me out of his sight. He adjusted the silver clasp on my shoulder armor, his fingers lingering for just a second too long.
We're getting out of this together.
We faced wave after wave, the packs relentless as they charged. Lucian moved with a skill that was almost too fast to follow, his every strike calculated. Noah fought beside him, fluid and fierce, a force to be reckoned with. There were moments when I caught one of them glancing over to make sure I was all right, and I felt a strange warmth settle over me, a deep sense of belonging that had nothing to do with victory. Days bled into nights, the battles stretching on until we could hardly remember a time when we weren't fighting. I could see the exhaustion in Lucian's face, in the way he clenched his jaw between fights as if to push himself just a little further. Noah's humor had all but faded, replaced by a look of quiet determination that was strangely humbling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we struck the last blow. The air stilled, and for a heartbeat all was silent. Lucian, battered and breathing heavily, looked at me with a raw intensity that made my pulse
Ruby,
quicken.
he murmured,
He
his
didn't
voice
say a
soft,
word,
almost
just
vulnerable.
reached out,
We couldn't have
brushing a
done this
strand of
without
hair
you.
from my face, his thumb grazing my cheek. There was something there, something I'd known for a while but hadn't dared to name. Noah approached, his gaze softer than I'd ever seen it. His usual bravado melted away.
You all right, Ruby?
His voice was low, almost vulnerable. I am Noah, I whispered, looking at him. The village gathered around us, followed by a celebration, though it was far from the grand events I'd imagined. Most of us were too exhausted to do more than gather around the campfire, leaning on each other, sharing quiet smiles and silent promises of loyalty. Lucian, still looking every bit the alpha, stood beside me. His arms slipped around my waist, pulling me close in a way that made my heart race despite everything we'd just been through.
Ruby,
He murmured, his voice soft, almost vulnerable.
we couldn't have done this without you.
I felt a warmth spread through me, his words hitting me harder than I'd expected. Noah stood a few steps away, his expression filled with pride. He stepped forward, clapping Lucian on the shoulder, a grin on his face even though I could see the hint of sadness in his eyes.
Here's to the strongest alpha pair I've ever seen.
He said, his tone light but carrying a depth that only the three of us understood. Lucian gave him a nod, his usual guarded expression softening just a bit.
Thank you, Noah, for everything.
The three of us stood in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own unspoken words.